I am especially honored to present Erin Dooley as she shares her excellent MCL project. Erin describes herself as a scholar in the making who is passionate about the intersection of theology, human behavior, and social transformation. Her project exemplifies her commitments and her self-understanding. And in her project, she masterfully puts public policy, specifically Project 2025, in conversation with womanist ethics and theology as a way of resisting the white Christian nationalist agenda. It is my pleasure to have been her advisor, and I am so proud of being a part of what she has created and excited about what she will share with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Letzum. That means a lot. Let me share my screen and we will begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My master thesis project is called Formed to Forget: How Project 2025's vision for education reflects a white Christian nationalist theology of control, and how a womanist ethic of remembrance and formation can reform public witness. My specific research question was, how does Project 2025's vision for public education reflect a white Christian nationalist theology of control, and how might a womanist ethic of remembrance and formation counteract the erasure of Black history and communal identity? Before I begin, I want to share something I did while writing this thesis. I bought a small block of clay and set out to make a bowl with my own hands. Something in me needed to feel what it meant to shape something while researching how power shapes us. As soon as the clay touched my hands, I understood that clay remembers. Every press, every pressure point, every moment of neglect or attention becomes part of its final form. And so does a society. This project began the moment I heard two distinguished Black women talk about the dismantling of the Department of Education. I remember sitting there and thinking, a society that does not want to remember must constantly train people to forget. A society ruled by forgetfulness must continuously shape people spiritually, socially, morally, into the kinds of citizens who will not question power, who will not ask where harm comes from, and who will not think critically about the stories that formed them. And I realized we are not simply living in a political crisis, we are living in a formational crisis. That is what drove this research. I am deeply tired of pastors, theologians, and Christian leaders refusing to take responsibility for how they are forming people theologically to be bad neighbors. And I'm tired of congregations who do not engage critical thinking, who do not pause to ask how they are being shaped, who is shaping them, and toward what end. And so the central argument of my thesis is this: Project 2025 is not merely a political blueprint, it is a theological blueprint or formation document that seeks to mold citizens into vessels of obedience and forgetfulness through a white Christian nationalist theology of control. When you first begin shaping clay, it is stubborn, uneven, full of its own history. The more I worked it, the more I saw my thesis taking shape in my hands. Formation is intentional. It is an artisan's craft. It leaves marks. When the Department of Education is targeted, it is not only education under threat, memory is under threat, identity is under threat, democracy is under threat, and theology itself is under threat. Because if you can control what people remember, you can control what they believe. And if you can control what they believe, you can control what they will permit. As I rolled the clay into form, I watched how pressure worked. A gentle press shapes, too much pressure distorts, uneven pressure cracks. My thesis draws from James K.A. Smith, who argues that we are formed not just by ideas, but by habits, practices, and environments, by the liturgies of everyday life. We are vessels formed by the hands of culture long before we are formed by the hands of the church. Project 2025 understands this. Its authors know that if you shape education, you shape imagination. And if you shape someone's imagination, you shape their desires. And if you shape their desires, you shape what their allegiance is. So, in this sense, Project 2025 is a potter. It is not interested in creating unique vessels, it is interested in mass production. My thesis uses prehistoric archaeologist Caroline Height's metaphor that clay is shaped through pressure, repetition, and environment. The pot's final form carries the fingerprints of the potter and the history of the clay. Formation is slow, embodied, and deeply relational. This matters because Project 2025 approaches human beings as clay to be controlled, not clay to be honored. It is formation without care, design without dignity, and power without relationship. At one point in my making of the bowl, I noticed cracks forming at the top, tiny fractures that told the truth about stress, about what happens when pressure is applied unevenly or when a structure is forced into shape too quickly. Project 2025 did not appear out of nowhere. The cracks in our national vessel have a long lineage. My research traces it back to Lewis Powell's 1971 memo, written just before he became a Supreme Court justice. Powell argued that business, whiteness, and political power were under the threat in the height of the civil rights movement. His memo called on corporate and political leaders to take control of education, media, law, theology, and the American imagination. And the Heritage Foundation, which authored Project 2025, is one of Powell's direct descendants. The same fear, the same desire for control, the same obsession with erasing memory in order to preserve power. Powell believed that if you can manage what people learn, you can manage what they love and eventually what they will defend. That is theology, that is formation. And that is exactly what Project 2025 attempts to do when it proposes to dismantle the Department of Education, erase federal protections, erase civil rights gains, erase accountability, erase history, because erasure is always the first step in domination. In pottery, ignoring cracks guarantees future breakage. You must address them early with pressure, water, smoothing, and care. One of the core questions of this thesis is, what happens to a society formed to forget? Renee Girard helps us understand that violence is not only physical, it is structural, psychological, and mimetic. Violence reproduces itself through imitation. A people without memory are a people that are easily controlled. A people without identity are a people that are easily manipulated. And a people without history are a people easily weaponized. Project 2025 intentionally forms citizens who cannot recognize harm because they cannot remember its history. And if you cannot recognize harm, you will inevitably participate in it. This is why the erasure of Black history is not accidental. It is a strategic move. It is theological. It is an attempt to detach a society from its moral conscience. As I smoothed the rim of the bowl, I thought about womanist ethics. The work felt tender, deliberate, and healing, like giving shape to something that holds memory, something that refuses to collapse. The second half of my thesis turns towards hope, a womanist ethic of remembrance, a counter formation, a theological repair to a society formed to forget. Womanist scholars like Emily M. Towns, Katie Cannon, and Shanika Walker Barnes insist that in order to tell the truth, you have to remember the truth. And in remembering, you resist the formative practices of forgetting. Towns calls this counter memory, a deliberate refusal to let dominant culture narrate the story, a regathering of what was broken, a healing of what was deformed. Counter memory, she writes, is a way of remembering and forgetting that starts with the local, the immediate, and the personal. end quote. It disrupts ignorance by centering stories that empire seeks to silence, and in doing so, it reshapes the theological imagination toward truth and justice. Katie Cannon says womanist ethics unmasks the power relationships beneath our theologies, revealing how theology has been used to justify oppression. And Joy DeGruy reminds us that elders, our ancestors, and our living wisdom keepers form us through story. Eldership shapes identity, memory shapes the moral life. So, the womanist ethic I propose is the deep ethical responsibility and theological duty of remembering. This ethic also requires that we live in community because not one singular person can remember all of our histories. A womanist ethic of remembrance forms people to remember, not to dominate, but to love, not to obey empire, but to recognize God in themselves and in their neighbors. When I lifted the finished bowl in my hand, it wasn't perfect. The rim was uneven, the base was crooked, the walls held the fingerprints of every moment I pressed hard or soft. But it was honest, and it remembered me. My thesis ends with a framework, 5 commitments for pastors, educators, and community leaders who want to form people toward love, truth, and justice instead of amnesia. Number 1, know thy history, because memory protects us from manipulation. Number 2, know thyself, because identity is rooted in community and not individualism. Number 3, love thyself, because shame is a tool of empire, not God. Number 4, love thy neighbor, because bad theology kills, and theology that harms your neighbor is not Christian. Number 5, live in harmony, borrowing from Dr. Randy Woodley, whose Indigenous framework reminds us that flourishing is communal, ecological, and interdependent. This framework is a theological alternative to the world Project 2025 attempts to create. It is a way of forming people to be human again. This thesis is deeply personal to my life story. I grew up in a church where theology was used to shame, silence, and control, a place where poverty was blamed on moral failure, a place where obedience was considered holiness, even when obedience caused harm. And I spent years unlearning that theology, years rebuilding my faith, years learning how to be human again. And now, as someone working in the South, in Durham, deeply invested in community formation, I see daily what formation can do. I see what memory can repair. I see what remembrance can restore. This thesis is part of my calling to help communities remember who they are, to resist theological violence, and to form people into vessels of dignity. My thesis ends with this truth: the formation is always happening. The only question is who is doing the forming and toward what end? If we are not intentional, Project 2025 and its theological imagination will form our society by default. It will form us to forget. It will form us to fear. It will form us to obey. But if we choose remembrance, if we choose history, if we choose truth, if we choose community, if we choose the wisdom of Black women, if we choose to love our neighbors, we can form something different. We can form a people who are resistant to erasure, a people who recognize harm because they remember what it looks like, a people who tell the truth, a people who love themselves and their neighbors because they remember what love is. And that ultimately is the calling of public theology: to form people not for control, but for community, not for empire, but for flourishing, not for forgetfulness, but for life, for living, and for being human. Thank you. Thank you.
Questions or comments?
Hello again. I want to say congratulations and thank you for the presentation. Very informative, very challenging. and I mean challenging you, challenge us to think and look at the clay and how it can be molded, and but also to how information can be used to mold us and to make us, and also to challenge us and take us away. So thank you. But here's my question to you, all right? How are you going to use this information for future? What are your ideas? What are your plans to use the thesis for further knowledge or exercise or continuation?
Mhm. Yeah, I would really love to see people engage in this material in a way where it teaches them to see differently. I think when it's almost like when you see something, you can't unsee it. So when you begin to see formation in the ways that you are being formed, meaning you're no longer just moseying along through life or even religious spaces or any space that might be forming you or anything that might be forming you, but you are beginning to think and are now aware of what are we now? What am I now? How did I become like this? And what will I become in the future based upon how I'm being formed right now? And I think if people understand that, and so I hope that this is the start of PhD research and some books down the road for myself personally. And I hope that as I engage in community, as a community developer running a nonprofit in Durham, that this type of information is quite literally merged and molded into the work that we're doing in neighborhoods. But I see it becoming um, more so in the hands of people so that if they have this understanding that they can almost protect themselves from harm, but that they can also participate in their own flourishing as well as the flourishing of the people they're responsible for.
Thank you. You said the key word. Book. Now, which is what the knowledge is. And that's how we can spread that knowledge by publishing it.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for that.
Hey, Erin, it's yeah, great job. That was so, I mean, you always bring it and you sound like you're preaching up there and I appreciate that. So thank you. That was awesome. I love the idea of a book and further research and all of that, but and you alluded to this a little bit with your nonprofit work, but how do you take it out of the realm of academia and actually make it practical? Like, what are you doing within your nonprofit to bring this to bear? Or maybe you're not there yet, but how can you see, you just finished it, but like, how can you see this going forward in that
Yeah.
practical application?
Yeah, in my own journey, which has brought me to Durham from Phoenix by way of Chicago, by way of Mississippi. So it's like this reverse migration journey for me coming back to the South. And even in reverse migration, it has a lot to do with remembering. It has a lot to do with remembering where I come from, my rootedness, and recovering my own Black identity. And so, for this particular neighborhood that we live in, which is a historic Black neighborhood that's been overly exploited, a highway came through it when it was after it was a Black Wall Street and destroyed a lot of its flourishing. And a lot of the work that we do in community development has a lot to do with relationship building, conversations, but helping people remember how beautiful they are, helping people remember the richness of their culture, of their history, of their identity, of what it means to be a Black, of what it means to be an elder, of what it means to be a youth or a young adult, and remembering that we are a community that has always known how to look after and care for one another, but we've been living in systems that have tried to separate that and had to try to pull it apart. So remembering and reverse migration within Black South, which is a big part of our story, is about rerouting ourselves and what makes us who we are, so that the tree can only go so high as the roots go deep. So it's a lot of like rerouting and remembering and putting ourselves in front of information that can help us remember our history and honor that history within one another.
Awesome, thank you. Good tree reference. We got our trees here.
Yeah.
Erin, I love your project, and in November, I chaired a panel at the American Academy of Religion on Project 2025 and the church. And I really am kicking myself for not knowing your project, because I would have told you to submit it there and present it at Boston, and 100 people would have just loved your presentation. But so wonderful job. And there are actually quite a few connections between your project and Marcella's. And the theologian that really connects both is Johann Baptist Metz, which you brought up, but you just mentioned it. And one of the things that Johann Baptist Metz brings up is the idea of remembering and how there are two sides to remembering. It's remembering not just the past, but the dangerous past, the past that we don't like to hear about, right? And remembering that past is a way of remembering a future for justice, right? So if you think about it in race terms, right? Remembering our history of racism in all its reality remembers a future where this is no longer an issue, right? And so, and a lot of times how we make this transition is mysticism, right? Is art, it's these like things that don't fit into categories. So I think there's a lot of this, a lot of connections that between the two of your projects that would be very fruitful in further conversation. And but this is wonderful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that thought. Yeah, I'm definitely taking notes on that and adding it to further research. I appreciate that.
Hey, Aaron, I, of course, was your second reader, and I've already told you how excellent your work was. And I'm the one who told Henry that he should have known it ahead of time.
But I repent.
No, he had no way of knowing that ahead of time. Like he said, he wished he had. And it would have, like he said, it would have fit perfectly and given you the further exposure. But you're gonna get further exposure on your own because your work is so excellent. And you know people like Raquel and Henry and others who can not speak for you, but speak on your behalf to get your work in the public sphere. And you'll do further educational work and writing and publication. I have no doubt. So again, congratulations. Just one quick question. How did you choose Durham or were you led to Durham? I know Durham a little bit.
Yeah. We
Yeah, some
chose.
great so well, a lot of people that are smart people and wealthy people who you might, be in touch with at some point, or maybe already are. But how did you choose Durham?
Yeah, we chose Durham. Honestly, the funny story is we knew we wanted to come to North Carolina. My husband, his family has been in this in North Carolina as far back as the 1830s as we were doing ancestral and genealogy research. And so we knew we wanted to do North Carolina. We were thinking about Charlotte, and I was like, it's too businessy corporate over there. We thought about Raleigh because it's the capital. But being down there, I was like, I'm still struggling to find all the black people. Like, where are the black people at? I'm not going to go from Arizona to North Carolina and not live by black people. But then we went to Durham, and there was this black-owned restaurant called BU Cafe. We went down Main Street, downtown Durham, got outside of it, black-owned, black people cooking, like just everything was what my soul was longing to see. And I was like, it's my first time in the South. Let me try shrimp and grits. I get shrimp and grits. And I was like, babe, they be cooking like this? Durham is it. Durham is it. So literally shrimp and grits, like in a spiritual way, connected me to this place. But turns out the house that we bought, we found out later that Kendall's great grandmother actually is from this very neighborhood. And the house that we bought sits on the same street that she used to live on in the 50s and 60s. And so it's kind of like a complete, almost like we were divinely led to this place in Durham, being called by our ancestors back home. So that's why we chose Durham.
Good, thank you.
What a wonderful story, Erin. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was wonderful. I think my question is, from today, you were talking about counter memory and imagination. And I was thinking that those two things to added for me make up Afrofuturism. And thinking about that led me to the Black Madonna and the imagining, the art that's been created around the Black Madonna. And so I wondered if there was a story, either a biblical story or a different kind of story that is connecting you as you've been doing your research.
Yeah. I guess I'll answer it this way, and I hope that it answers your question. But the story that I often think about is the time that we went and visited the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And if you've ever been there, when you walk into the display, you see a lot of enslaved ancestors, their heads sticking out from sand on either side of you. It's kind of an immersive experience. It's quite um, overwhelming, but you see their heads in the sand, and then you also see and hear water, like the ocean, washing over them. And then above that, you see the sky and you see stars in the sky. And I noticed if you paid attention to it, there were shooting stars. And so it was like this immersive experience that constantly reminds me about dreaming and imagination. And even to use and to credit Dr. Irie Session, who talks a lot about decolonizing imagination, of what it means to create space for imagination that liberates and frees us. And so when I saw those shooting stars, I was reminded of the ways that I am an embodiment of the things that they dreamt about. But the thing that got them out of enslavement was that they never stopped dreaming. They never stopped imagining what freedom looked like or tasted like. They never stopped imagining liberation and what it would mean to be free, to no longer be enslaved. And so I think, in order to create new worlds, we have to create space for ourselves to dream and to imagine, just like what you're saying. And so that's a story that I often think about, an experience slash story, I guess.
I love that. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more question or comment. Going once, going twice. Thank you very much, Erin. Well done.
Thank you, everyone.
So let us have a 5-minute break as we transition to Devante. In the meantime,